Hello, how are you doing? Welcome back to my channel and to this video. So today we have another bedtime story. So the last episode, I guess, we read Jack and the Beanstalk, and 2 days ago I sent out a community post and I'd selected 3 books. We had Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, and Little Red Riding Hood. And Hansel and Gretel won by almost 50%, and I think about 200 people have voted, so thank you so much. If this one is as popular as the last one, maybe I'll start this into a reoccurring theme. So do watch my community posts for options of stories. So, without any further ado, I present to you Hansel and Gretel, Chapter 1. Down in the valley was a wood. Next to the wood was a cottage, and in the cottage lived a woodcutter and his 2 children, a little boy called Hansel and his sister Gretel. The woodcutter was a very poor man. Work was scarce, and he had fallen on very hard times. He couldn't even earn enough to feed the family every day, so more often than not, the children went hungry. Despite their situation, Hansel and Gretel's spirits remained high. They never once complained. They could see how much their father loved them and how hard he was working, even if his work brought little reward. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, the woodcutter sat talking to his wife next to the fire. The woman was not Hansel and Gretel's real mother. She did not care for them one bit. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was an evil stepmother that wanted them gone at the first opportunity. "Oh, wife," said the woodcutter, "I can barely support you and myself, never mind the children. What on earth are we going to do?" "I know what to do," she said, a wicked smile creeping onto her lips. "Tell me, dear wife," said the woodcutter. "Tomorrow morning," said the stepmother, "I will take the children deep into the wood, into the very thickest part, and leave them there for the wolves. They will then be out of our way. Your wages will support us, and we'll be unshackled from this dreadful poverty." "Feed them to wolves?" repeated the woodcutter in horror. "I've never heard such nonsense in all my days." "Foolish man," she replied, "then we will all perish. You are as well to go and cut wood for our own coffins." The woodcutter said nothing. Hansel and Gretel's empty, rumbling bellies had kept them awake. They had heard everything, especially the bit about being left out for the wolves, which had terrified both of them beyond words. "What is going to happen to us, Hansel?" sniffed Gretel as she wiped a tear away. "Don't worry, Gretel," he whispered. "I know exactly what to do." Chapter 2. They lay still until the grown-ups were asleep. As soon as it was quiet, Hansel got up, put on his coat and slipped outside. Making sure not to wake anyone, the moon shone brightly, lighting up the garden. Hansel looked around. Then, without delay, he began picking up handfuls of little white pebbles that lay on the garden path. He carried on stuffing his pockets until they were full to the brim, then returned to bed. The next morning, there came a rap at the bedroom door. "Up you get, you lazy pair of rats," cried the stepmother. "You need to come with me into the wood to gather kindling for the fire. Quick, smart." Hansel and Gretel got up. The stepmother handed Gretel a piece of bread and said, "Take this for your lunch. It is for both of you and must last you all day, so don't eat it all at once. You won't get more." Gretel took the bread and they set out into the woods. Hansel seemed preoccupied. Every few steps he would turn around as if looking for something. This strange behaviour did not go unnoticed by the stepmother. "Why do you keep dropping back and looking behind?" she snapped, clearly irritated. "I saw a cat," said Hansel, "and I'm checking to see if it's still following us." "Well, hurry along, child," she said sharply. "We don't have time for your childish antics." Chapter 3. Hansel was lying. He had not seen a cat. He was staying behind to drop white pebbles, the ones he had knowingly gathered the previous night, onto the ground behind him as he walked. They carried on walking. After some considerable time, they reached an opening. "Come, children," said the stepmother. "Gather some sticks and I'll make us a fire. It's getting very cold and you need some rest." Hansel and Gretel gathered the sticks. "After making the fire," said the stepmother, "sit down and rest here, children. I will return with your father once we have finished our work to get you." Then she scurried off. Hansel and Gretel sat eating bread by the crackling fire. The crust had become a little stale in Gretel's pocket, but they were too hungry to notice. After wolfing down their bread, they quickly grew tired and fell asleep. In fact, they fell into such a deep sleep that they did not notice the hours passing. Chapter 4. Gretel awoke with a start. "It's dark," she cried, "and there's no sign of stepmother or father. Oh, Hansel, I am so very scared. What shall we do?" "Fear not, dear sister," said Hansel. "I have a cunning plan that will get us home safely." The full moon shone brightly in the night sky. "Do you see that?" said Hansel, pointing forward. As the light hit the path in front of them, the white pebbles that Hansel had dropped from his pockets along the journey started to glitter and sparkle in the darkness. "Brilliant!" cried Gretel. "You laid the pebbles to guide us home. Oh, what a very clever brother you are." Hansel smiled. They walked hand in hand all night and reached home just before dawn the following day. Their stepmother was furious to see they had returned home safely. Her scheming plan had failed. Chapter 5. 1 year passed. Times had not improved. In fact, just as the stepmother had predicted, the situation had worsened greatly. It was now so dire that only half a loaf of bread remained in the larder. "Something must be done," said the stepmother. Something must be done, the stepmother thought to herself. That evening, after everyone else was in bed, the stepmother stayed up to create her wicked master plan. "I've got it," she said. "I'll take them even deeper into the woods this time. I know just the place. They will surely never find their way home. A wolf will eat them both up, and I'll be able to live in peace and plenty." Hansel and Gretel's empty, rumbling tummies had kept them awake once more. Again, they heard everything. As before, Hansel waited until the stepmother had gone to bed and made his way out the front door. But to his horror, this time around, it was locked. His heart sank. Hansel returned to bed without a single pebble in his pocket. Chapter 6. Early the next morning, the stepmother burst into their bedroom, yanked the children out of bed, shouting, "Get dressed at once, you lazy pair of rats." Once they were dressed, she gave them a small piece of bread each, and they set off into the woods. Hansel put his piece of bread in his pocket. As they walked, he stopped every so often, broke off a few crumbs, and dropped them onto the ground, just as he had done with the pebbles. They carried on walking for some time. As they walked, the path narrowed, the trees became thick, very thick. So dense, in fact, that they could barely see a few yards ahead. Hansel and Gretel had never been this deep into the woods before. They were starting to feel very frightened. Soon they reached a small clearing. "Come, children," said the stepmother. "Gather some sticks, and I will make us a fire. It's getting very cold, and you need some rest." Hansel and Gretel did as requested, and their stepmother made the fire. "Rest here, children," she said, while I go and help your father. Eat your bread, and then lie down and sleep for a while, and we will return in the evening when our work is finished." Before Hansel or Gretel could reply, she was gone. Chapter 7. They sat for a while. Gretel then took out her bread and offered half of it to Hansel. "You have half, brother, as you've scattered yours along the path to guide us home." They ate the bread together in front of the roaring fire, then slept. Many hours passed. As darkness fell, still no one came to fetch them. Suddenly, Gretel awoke. "It is dark, Hansel," she said, "and I am frightened." "Don't be," said Hansel. "My trail of breadcrumbs will easily show us the way home. We must just wait a little longer until the moon is bright, and then we will set off." The moon came out, the path lit up, but to their horror there were no breadcrumbs to be found. You see, unbeknown to Hansel and Gretel, a little squirrel had been following behind them on their journey, and no sooner had Hansel dropped a crumb than it was gobbled up by their cleverly bushy-tailed companion. "We're doomed," cried Gretel. There, dear sister," said Hansel, placing his arm gently around her back. "I'm sure we'll find a way out without any crumbs," he said confidently. Hansel may have sounded confident. He was, truth be told, anything but. He was scared inside, as Gretel kept his fears to himself. Chapter 8. They set out into the darkness. 2 nights and days had passed, but they failed to make it out of the wood. Now disorientated and weary from lack of food, they found themselves heading deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. "I see something," cried Gretel with delight. "It's a house," replied Hansel. Suddenly, buoyed with a burst of energy, they ran towards the house as quickly as their legs would carry them, and as they approached, Gretel let out a yelp of excitement, for what stood before them was no ordinary house, quite the contrary. It was a house built entirely of gingerbread, decorated ornately with the finest cakes, tarts, and barley sugars a child could imagine. "Let us stop here and feast a while," mumbled Hansel, through a mouthful of gingerbread he had just extracted from the downstairs windowsill. Gretel looked up briefly. She nodded, and then carried on gouging great fistfuls of cake as she lay on the ground. Suddenly, a whispering voice came from behind the front door. "Who is eating up my house?" it said quietly. "The wind. The wind, it's only the wind," replied Hansel. The door creaked open, then opened, and hobbled out an extremely old woman. She was ever so frightful to look at. Her skin glowed a green tinge, her nose hooked at the tip, and was covered in enormous warts. The children were terrified. "Dear children, come close, as my eyesight is very weak," said the old lady. "You are far too young to be out here in this dangerous woods all alone. Come in and stay with me for a while." As she spoke, she seized the children by the scruff of the neck, marched them inside, and sat them down at the kitchen table. Chapter 10. Before them lay a gigantic mound of sandwiches, buttered crumpets, steaming pancakes, fruit and nuts. "What are you waiting for?" said the old lady. "Help yourself." So they did. Once their bellies were full to bursting, Hansel and Gretel were shown to a beautiful room with 2 little beds surrounded by white curtains. They lay down, shut their eyes, and were asleep moments after their heads hit the soft silken pillows. This, however, a nasty ruse, a trick, a scheming ploy by the beastly old lady. She was not, in fact, a lady at all. She was the wickedest of all witches in the wood, and she had built her house out of gingerbread as bait to snare unsuspecting children. Once she had them under her power, she would feed them until they got very fat, then boil them alive and eat them for her supper, on a special day that she liked to call Feast Day. Chapter 11. Early the next morning, the witch entered the children's bedroom and stood over them menacingly as they slept. "Ah, yes," she muttered to herself as she leant over the bed and sniffed at Hansel's face. "This one will do very nicely for a feast day. Yep, just a bit of fattening up and he will taste delicious." The witch could not see Hansel's face, for her eyesight was much too weak, but her terrific sense of smell knew instantly that he was a boy, and boy was her favourite. She adored the extra meaty taste of their flesh. Chapter 12. Suddenly, she grabbed Hansel with both hands and dragged him into a little cage behind the house and locked the door. He let out a terrific scream, but it was too late. The cage itself was the size of a dog kennel, surrounded on all 4 sides by thick, wrought iron bars. The door was fixed. He let out a terrific scream, but it was too late. The cage itself was about the size of a dog kennel, surrounded on all 4 sides by thick, wrought iron bars, and the door was fixed tightly shut with an enormous padlock. There was no escape. I apologise. After this, the witch went back to the bedroom and cried, "Wake up, you wretched lazy girl. You must go immediately to the well and get me some water. I must boil up some delicious treats for your brother, so I can fatten him up before I eat him on feast day." "Hansel," cried Gretel, "where are you?" "He can't hear you," replied the witch. "I've put him in a cage behind the house. Now, run along and fetch me the water." From then on, Hansel was fed a feast at every meal time, while Gretel, who had now become the witch's servant girl, had to survive on dry crusts and scraps. Chapter 13. Every morning, the witch would go to the cage and say, "Hansel, stick your finger so that I may test if you are fat enough for eating." But Hansel was too clever for that. He knew the witch had very poor eyesight, so he kept an old chicken bone from one of his meals, and each day he would stick this bone through the bars instead. Many weeks passed and the witch grew impatient. She had waited long enough for her feast day, and she could wait no longer. Chapter 14. "The time has come," she said. "I will have my feast today. Go, Gretel, and fetch me a pail of water, enough to fill a whole pot to boil your brother." Gretel howled as tears rolled down her pale face. "Your sobbing is useless, girl," said the witch. "There is not a single soul that can hear you out here in the deepest woods." She was right, and reluctantly Gretel obeyed. When Gretel returned from the well, the witch was busy kneading dough. She turned to Gretel and said, "I have heated the oven. We will bake some bread while I wait for the pot to boil. Creep inside the oven, my dear, and see if it is hot enough. But Gretel was wise to this request. She knew precisely why the witch wanted her to creep inside the oven, to bake her alive and gobble her up. So Gretel replied, "But witch, I don't know how to open the door." The witch opened the oven door. "But witch, I can't possibly fit through that narrow door." The witch placed her head inside the oven door to show Gretel how it should be done. But in that moment Gretel pounced and leapt forward, shoving the witch with all her might into the flaming oven. She quickly slammed the door and bolted it shut, baking the witch alive inside. Chapter 15. Gretel rushed to the cage, shouting as she opened the door, "Hansel, Hansel, we are free. The wicked old witch is dead." Hansel flew like a bird from the cage, and as the door opened, the children ran into each other's arms and held each other for a few seconds. "Come on," said Hansel, "let's get out of here." "Wait," said Gretel. "I've seen a chest in the witch's bedroom which is full of the most magnificent jewels." The children filled their pockets with as many jewels as they could carry and set off into the enchanted wood. They walked for a few days, and then, as if by magic, their surroundings became clear to them once more, and they returned home safely. Their father wept great tears of joy to see his children safe and well. Hansel said, "Look, father," taking enormous handfuls of shining gemstones from his pockets and placing them on the table. "We're rich now." Gretel then looked very slowly and cautiously around the room and finally saying, "Where is wicked stepmother?" To the father replied, "She died." From that moment, all of their worries disappeared, and they went on to live a life of wealth and happiness. The end. So, that story was a little bit longer than 10 minutes, which is how it's advertised. However, I hope you did enjoy Hansel and Gretel. It was a story that I didn't actually know all too well, but you guys really wanted it, so I hope you have enjoyed. If you have, please do let me know by leaving a like. However, as always, if you are asleep, then sleep well. And I will see you again very